A new video emerging this morning of another police shooting last night in Minnesota. This as protests in Baton Rouge continue overnight as a second video is released showing another angle of the deadly shooting of 37-year-old Alton Sterling.
Right, and there's little doubt that this would be happening if it were not for the death of Breonna Taylor.
Officers conducting a drug raid burst into Taylor's home and shot her 8 times.
This investigation will be much broader than just what happened in that case. It'll look at the entire police department to see if there is a pattern or an intentional practice of violating civil rights, especially of racial discrimination.
32-year-old Philando Castile, along with his girlfriend and her child, pulled over last night.
No federal charges against Baltimore police officers in the death of Freddie Gray. Gray was arrested in 2015 for having a switchblade, dying after bouncing around in the back of a police van.
That's when police say Officer Dean shot and killed 28-year-old Tatiana Jefferson after a concerned neighbor had called a non-emergency number because her front door was open.
Sacramento's district attorney announced over the weekend that the city would not charge the 2 police officers who shot and killed an unarmed black man last year. You recall this story, 22-year-old Stephon Clark was fatally shot while running from police. He was shot 8 times in his grandmother's backyard.
After Geiger mistakenly entered the wrong home thinking it was hers, then fatally shooting 26-year-old Botham Jean.
At breakdown in court today, the former Dallas police officer charged with murder in the shooting death of her neighbor. She says she entered his apartment mistaking it for her own.
For the second time in as many weeks, a grand jury has found the evidence is just not there to charge a white police officer in connection with the death of a black civilian.
Unseen surveillance footage captured at a convenience store the night before Michael Brown was fatally shot by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014.
One of the officers employed a chokehold. Moments later, while on the ground after complaining he couldn't breathe, he was dead.
Only on News 5 tonight, we've learned that after months of review with the State Attorney General's office, Tanisha Anderson's case
Timothy Lohman and Frank Garmbach in the shooting death of 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Rice was shot in November of last year after being spotted waving a gun in a park. It turned out to be a boy.
Officials in Minneapolis hoping for calm tonight after a former police officer was charged with murder and manslaughter in the death of George Floyd. Officer pinned Floyd's neck to the ground for several minutes as he pleaded he couldn't breathe.
the Great Migration. This was the movement of about 6 million African Americans from the southern parts of the United States to the urban North and Midwest states. This was due mainly to the poor economic conditions and the dominant racial segregation that was prominent in southern states. This is one of the largest mass internal movements in history. African Americans migrated up north in search of a solution to racial and economic problems, but the people who inhabited the northern states were not accustomed to seeing African Americans. This would include their police departments, which constituted of mainly white people. They reacted to their presence with hostility, which stemmed from racist stereotypes. They genuinely were of the belief that black men specifically possessed a tendency towards criminal behavior. This led to things like physical assault, excessive use of force, verbal abuse, and at times, police homicide. During this period, World War II was happening. This created an expectation amongst African Americans that if they were helping to defend the country abroad and fight for democracy abroad, then that would hopefully and inevitably lead to greater freedom and democracy back at home. As fair as these expectations were, African Americans still did go in segregated units to defend the country abroad, and this should have been a sign of things to come. After the war was over, black people still faced brutality at the hands of law enforcement. As things grew worse, black people started to demand respect from judiciaries, law enforcement agencies, and local governments, but they were still met with violence. Police brutality had replaced lynchings, and police officers had replaced slave patrols. These cases of brutality led to several race riots. From the Watts riots, to the Detroit riots, to the Miami riots, and even the infamous LA riots of 1992, which is still, to this day, the worst race riot in American history. Qualified immunity is a legal principle that shields government officials from being held personally liable for constitutional violations. In layman's terms, this implies that an officer who knowingly violates someone's human rights will be immune from prosecution and liability, unless the victim can point to a case in the past with the same specific context and similar conduct. This doctrine has become the cornerstone for the lack of accountability in law enforcement in America. It has consistently led to the dismissal of cases without thorough review and has contributed massively to the reckless attitude law enforcement have had towards ethnic minorities. As a police officer, if I know that I won't be held accountable for my actions, I am more than likely to make impulsive and unconstitutional decisions. The biggest problem with this attitude and lack of accountability is that African Americans have disproportionately been at the receiving end of actions that stem from this. If the Supreme Court do not step in to dissolve or reevaluate this doctrine, it will be nearly impossible to hold bad cops accountable for their actions.
So, how do we leave here?
There are three different reactions to what you can do in terms of combating police brutality, especially police brutality in Black and brown communities, because we know that's where it's disproportionate. So you can either reform the police departments, you can either defund the police departments, or you can disband the police departments. Now, what we've generally seen is that we've seen reforming. So we've seen de-escalation techniques being taught. We've seen the implementation of body cameras. We've seen implicit bias training. That hasn't necessarily worked because we know that not all police departments have done it. We know that police officers are turning off their body cameras. They're not engaging their body cameras. Implicit bias training doesn't seem to be working. The next step would be defunding the police departments. That does not mean abolishing. It means taking some of those funds, and let's face it, there's about $6 billion that are sent to police departments to militarize the police departments. They have bayonets, they have armored vehicles, aircraft, that kind of thing.
Right.
When you defund the police departments, you take parts of those budgets and you send them to social services within communities.
I support investing in communities so that they become more healthy and therefore more safe. Right now, what we're seeing in America is many cities spend over 1/3 of their entire city budget on policing. But meanwhile, we've been defunding public schools for years in America. We've got to re-examine what we're doing with American taxpayer dollars and ask the question, are we getting the right return on our investment? Are we actually creating healthy and safe communities? And that's a legitimate conversation, and it requires a really critical evaluation.
We need three things, in my view, and that I've been pushing for years. You need the right type of people in law enforcement, so that means hiring practices reform, a big-time focus on communication skills, and guardianship, not warriors, that apply. And that is everything from needing people in your communities to live there. But then you also need the right training and the right incentive structure. Right now, we put a lot of emphasis on arrests and tickets and kind of enforcement, not necessarily on positive outcomes, like how many people have you helped, how many situations have you de-escalated. But then you also need accountability. And we're focusing rightly a lot on that right now because that's an important part. And that's things like the proper use of force, things like ending qualified immunity, things like reallocating dollars into other parts of the system. That's part of the incentive structure. So there's a whole thing. You need to work on them all at the same time.